This is my concern with the Ukraine war. In some quarters of American society, there are people pushing back against U.S. support for Ukraine. Do you think if Americans got tired of supporting a war effort against Russia in Ukraine, my concern is that they'll also have the same feeling for Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Why support that? Why get more U.S. money or troops involved?
Right. I mean, so on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, there are isolationists who would prefer not to help these countries defend themselves. The problem is that if China takes over Taiwan, for example, it's going to take over the chip industry, the computer chip industry that's in Taiwan, and it can use that computer chip industry to build up its military, to build an effective artificial intelligence capability, to build supercomputers that can model nuclear explosions and hypersonic missiles, right? So if China manages to take over Taiwan, they can then use Taiwan against us in the future. And we know from Rush Doshi's book, The Long Game, that China seeks to replace American power globally. They want to be a global hegemon. So we really can't give an inch to China or Russia. Russia's such a close ally to China. Without that inch eventually, without taking the risk that that inch would eventually be used against us. And that's why we can't really afford to just be pure isolationists and believe that we can live in our castle and the rest of the world can go to hell. We can't, because the rest of the world, will, if we allow China and Russia to take over significant parts of the rest of the world, they will use that against us.
Well, we also can't be isolationists in a world where we are getting resources and relying on resources from other countries. In other words, like when our, renewable energy, like windmills and solar panels come from China, when our many of our products, even some of our food comes from China, when we're so reliant on that, then we can't also try to be politically isolationist. If we were not tied, if none of the Western countries were tied to the Chinese Communist Party, I think you could make maybe somewhat more of an argument for isolationism. But also in that scenario, the Chinese Communist Party would not have the money or other resources to survive as long as it has.
Well, so the isolationist argument would be that we can produce our own food, we can produce our own windmills, and the tariffs are actually on China goods are making us more independent from China. We're decoupling from China. The problem, I think, with the isolationist argument, I would argue, is more military and global and economic, that China will, if we leave the rest of the world to China and Russia's expansion, they will eventually become much more, already actually, by purchasing power parity, China exceeds our GDP. I think that shift happened about 2014 or 2017. They exceed the European Union GDP by purchasing power parity. How much stuff they can buy, steel, ships, bread with their dollar, with their money, compared to how much we can buy with ours. If we let that trend continue and we let them take over larger and larger chunks of territory, I mean, there's a map of, China claims to own the whole South China Sea. They claim to own Taiwan. There's an old map that shows China's control over all of Southeast Asia, right? And they could eventually use that map in the same way that they've used old maps of the South China Sea to claim that they actually own all of Southeast Asia. And they can just keep doing this. They can keep inventing ownership of further and further territories abroad. They actually made fake, if you read this book, The History of the South China Sea, by Bill Hayton. They fake these stone markers on some of the islands in the South China Sea to pretend like they've owned it for centuries, for decades. And so they're capable of doing this, their propaganda apparatus and their legal apparatus is capable of faking all this information and claiming ever greater territories globally. So we can't leave them to their own devices. We essentially have to contain them. Now, containment has been a bad word in the past, but I think we're starting to think more along those lines. Our politicians claim that we're not containing China economically, but many of the technologies that we're controlling with export controls will actually not only contain them militarily, but will also contain them economically.
Yeah. Well, I think when it comes to old maps, I think this is actually a really interesting thing because they can keep gradually uncovering new maps. And I mean, there's even many years ago, I read the book by Gavin Menzies, 1421, When China Discovered America. And the author posits that in 1421, this is early Ming Dynasty, Chinese treasure ships were sailing around the world and even visited parts of North and South America. Now, whether that's true or not is irrelevant, but what is relevant is that you now have essentially inadvertently, this book has kind of laid out this path of potential claims. And obviously it seems ludicrous in the year 2023 to say China would be interested in taking over this much of the world. But if you look 50, 100 years down the line, you don't know what's in the long game.
Yeah. Admiral Zheng He, right?
Yeah,
the
Muslim eunuch, captain of the treasure fleet.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not just through territorial conquest, obviously, that they would take over territories. The issue of elite capture in Canada is over the top right now. I mean, there's a former CSIS official. CSIS is the Canadian version of the CIA that basically claims that every government in Canada, whether conservative or liberal, for decades has been compromised by the CCP in one way or another, at one time or another. And he's getting a lot of media attention in Canada right now. And I mean, even Justin Trudeau, right, the current prime minister, has an issue with his family foundation having taken donations. So maybe $1 million Canadian dollars. So, these things are very serious. And there's that. And then there's also the issue of China's increasing influence in international fora, whether that's the UN or, the WTO, the World Bank, IMF, or its own investment vehicles, the AIIB, the Belt and Road, right? All of these are international organizations, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. All of these are international organizations that allow China to increase its influence, engagement economically. And that's all a potentiality for elite takeover of countries.
I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses of how the U.S. has responded to China, just that Americans understand military warfare, but the idea that economic warfare exists and is equally a real threat, I think it's just a lot more difficult for people to understand, particularly because, America has really dominated the world through economics, and it has not been a sort of aggressive expansionism the way China's been. It's been putting McDonald's everywhere. But I think this is a big limitation in getting the United States to really fight back and become aware of the threat, particularly, you can see in the Pacific Island nations. China is absolutely modeling the strategy of World War II era Imperial Japan with their takeover of these Pacific Island nations, but it's all done economically. There hasn't been shots fired yet.
The Financial Times recently had an article, and the title of the article is "Apple is a Chinese Company." Apple is one of our most successful companies. If you read the article, it says, it kind of moderates its position, saying it's as much a Chinese company as it is an American company. But still, I mean, most of, Apple's so dependent on Chinese labor in China and on the Chinese consumer that it's arguably not just an American company. It has a lot of political influence in the United States. Tim Cook can call up any president that we have, Republican or Democrat, and he can arrange a lunch meeting. And he can make Beijing's case for not intervening in Taiwan or decreasing our military spending in Ukraine, all of which serve China's long-term interests. And then Tim Cook could go back to China and Beijing and say, oh, well, I had a lunch with the president and, I told him your position. I hope you can approve my new factory in Guangzhou or something. So there's a risk of China trading trade privileges, investment privileges with our biggest corporations in exchange for their support in Washington, D.C. And that's part of the influence operations that, unfortunately, we rarely consider. Although I think we know it's there because during the Trump administration, you did have officials pointing out that this was not an okay thing to do.
That makes me think of Elon Musk and Tesla, because I know recently he was able to open up a big new Shanghai factory, but at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party is also making a push to make and sell their own electric vehicles. I think this. Well, let me ask you, what does this tell us about how the Communist Party is able to leverage Chinese society for economic warfare?
Well, I think the Tesla example is really apropos. They brought Tesla in. They gave them a lot of access, a lot of market access. They helped them build up, and then they built up their own parallel industry. BYD, electric vehicles, and other electric vehicles are now competing with Tesla. And now that they're competing with Tesla, China's engineering all these recalls. Just in the past couple of months, you've got a million plus Tesla vehicles being recalled in China, because the hood could open or because, the gas pedal could stay, you're not warning the user to take his foot off the gas quickly enough, stuff that could be bogus. And that's going to shift a lot of the consumers in China away from Tesla vehicles and over to Chinese electric vehicles. Those Chinese electric vehicles now get much cheaper. They can be sold globally and outcompete European and U.S. Electric vehicles in our own markets. So, this is kind of the program, the strategy, the economic warfare strategy, I would argue, that China has followed from the beginning. They invite companies in, they give them short-term profits. The CEOs take home fat bonuses because their bonuses are based on quarterly stock increases. The CEOs are paying a lot of attention to short-term profits and not a lot of attention to long-term shareholder value. And the Chinese get the technology. They produce companies that outcompete the original company. And this is what they're trying to do with the general aviation industry now, with their new planes. Pretty soon, I think you will see not only global competition that beats our electric vehicles out, but if we don't do something, you'll see Chinese planes beating out Airbus and Boeing. Hasn't happened yet, but I think it could at some point in the next 10, 20 years.